Whispers in the walls. It had stood at the edge of Blackthorn Woods for over 100 years, and in all that time, no one who crossed its rotted threshold ever stayed the same again, not truly, no matter how skeptically they entered, no matter how brave or disbelieving or stubborn. Something in the Holloway house always reached out, always lingered in the mind like soot in the lungs, like the ghost of an idea too dark to speak aloud. And over the decades, the people of Blackthorn learned to cross the street when passing it, learned to drive an extra 2 miles around the outskirts rather than take the road that curved near its collapsing fence, because some truths were too jagged to bear and some houses too hungry to ignore. Evelyn Grayson had always believed that fear was simply the absence of information. A freelance investigative journalist and rising star in the world of fringe podcasting, she'd built her modest reputation on ghost tours debunked, seances exposed, and psychics reduced to stammering apologies when confronted with their own lies. Her podcast, The Rational Medium, enjoyed a healthy audience of listeners eager to see the veil pulled back on the strange and unknown, and she had no intention of stopping now. Especially not with a new season beginning and a new obsession forming in her mind like a splinter under the skin. Holloway House, she had discovered while scrolling through forgotten forums and dusty town archives, had a body count. Not just 1 or 2 vanished teenagers or vague stories of cursed rooms. No, the house had an official ledger. A failed exorcism in 1912, a missing family in 1947, a local priest who slit his own throat on the doorstep in 1983, and a particularly infamous case in 1995 when 2 college students dared to stay the night and were found the next morning, their fingernails embedded in the wooden floor as though they tried to claw their way out from something unspeakable. The stories all led back to one name, Marianne Holloway. A socialite turned recluse after a string of tragedies, including the drowning of her only child and the mysterious disappearance of her husband. She was said to have gone mad in the house and died alone in 1897, though no one ever found a body, only blood on the walls, symbols carved into every room, and a journal filled with unholy prayers addressed not to God but to something deeper, older, and crueler. Of course, Evelyn wasn't there to believe in ghosts. She was there to prove once and for all that the Holloway house was nothing more than a monument to collective hysteria, an architectural relic twisted by rumor, fueled by grief, and made monstrous by the passage of time and repetition. She arrived just after midnight, as the wind died and the woods behind her fell unnaturally silent, carrying a canvas backpack filled with essentials. A portable recorder, a thermal camera, batteries, water, her grandmother's iron locket, given to her with trembling hands and eyes that wouldn't meet hers, and the resolve of a woman who had faced down a cult in the Appalachian Mountains and lived to edit the footage herself. The front door moaned as she pushed it open, revealing a cavern of shadows and decay, and for a brief moment, as her flashlight flickered, catching the glint of shattered mirrors and wilted wallpaper. Evelyn felt something she'd never admit on air, the first ripple of unease, like cold fingers grazing the nape of her neck. She pressed record. Evelyn Grayson, she whispered into the static. Holloway House. Midnight. Let's see what you've got. And the house, listening, smiled with broken teeth. It was the stillness that first made Evelyn feel like she was not alone. Not the creaking of floorboards beneath her boots, nor the whistling of the wind through shattered panes, but the stillness that followed her with every breath she took, the silence that seemed too intentional, too poised, as though the air itself were waiting, holding something back just long enough for her to realize that she was not walking into an empty place, but entering something more like a sleeping mouth, a cavernous thing with splinters for teeth and grief soaked into every board. The deeper she moved into the house, the less she relied on her flashlight to see, and the more she began to feel the architecture around her as a kind of malignant geography, where rooms stretched too long, where doorways leaned subtly inward like watching eyes, and where the ceilings sloped just unnaturally enough to inspire discomfort without immediate recognition. Until suddenly she realized she was not where she thought she'd be, the map in her mind no longer matching the hallways her feet had taken her through. She tried to stay calm. She whispered commentary into her recorder, voice clipped and firm, but she could hear the tension in her throat, the way her breath trembled between words, and it wasn't helped by what she began to find scattered throughout the rooms, photographs burned around the edges, all showing the same woman with hollow eyes. Children's toys arranged in circles around charred candles, blackened roses crushed into pages of hymnals with passages scratched out and others underlined with what looked disturbingly like dried blood. In one room, she found a child's doll with no face. In another, a mirror that reflected everything except her. And everywhere she turned, the symbols returned, scratched deeply into the walls and floors, some familiar in shape, a pentagram, an eye, a serpent devouring its own tail. And others entirely alien, made of lines that twisted the brain just to follow them. Then came the sounds. It began as soft humming, distant, tuneless, a lullaby heard underwater, and then grew sharper, layered with whispers that slithered through the walls and floorboards, rising and falling like breath, like chant, always just below comprehension, always just enough to erode certainty. She tried to follow them, tried to trace the whispers to their source, and that was how she found the trapdoor beneath a moth-eaten rug in the master bedroom, a door of ancient, iron-bound wood sealed with rusted chains, the padlock snapped off as if by force, not recently, but long ago, and left slightly ajar. The smell that rose from it was the worst thing Evelyn had ever inhaled, sour, rotted, cloying, and yet she couldn't stop herself from pushing it open. Below was darkness. Not the kind that surrendered to flashlights, but a darkness that ate light, that twisted shadows into the shape of things not quite human. She descended. The ladder groaned beneath her, and the moment her feet touched the dirt floor, the hatch above slammed shut with a force that sent a scream tearing out of her throat, the echo swallowed by the stone walls around her. She turned slowly, and what she saw made her fall to her knees. It was a shrine. In the center, a rusted iron bed stained with black and red, chains bolted to its frame, candles burned without heat, casting warped shadows that stretched toward her like arms, and in the far corner, barely visible, was a skeletal figure in a blood-soaked wedding gown, its eye sockets glowing faintly, its jaw wide, and its bony hands held out as if beckoning her closer. And then it moved. The scream that erupted from the skeletal thing's open mouth was not a sound of anguish or fear, but something infinitely worse, a sound of recognition, as though it had waited for Evelyn, had known her name long before she ever whispered it into her recorder, and had been aching for this very moment through years of silence and rot, waiting for flesh to return to the house so it could finish what had begun so many decades ago. Evelyn backed away, stumbling, her boots skidding across the dirt as she turned and clawed at the walls, searching for a ladder that had already vanished behind the stone, now just a blank surface where no escape existed, and even as her mind screamed to retreat, her body remained fixed in place, paralyzed by the unnatural gravity of the entity that now floated forward, its gown unraveling in tatters, its fingers trailing black mist that whispered as it curled along the air. It spoke. Not in words, but in images, in memories, in pulses of agony that stabbed directly into her brain, the image of a child drowning beneath ice while a woman screamed herself hoarse, the snap of a neck in a dark hallway, blood blooming across white sheets, and then the sound of chanting, low and guttural, as Marianne Holloway carved symbols into her own skin with a broken mirror, whispering over and over, "Return what was taken. Return what was taken." Evelyn felt her knees buckle. The spirit hovered before her now, eyes flickering, mouth wide enough to crack the skull, and from its maw poured not words but a river of black water, thick with ash and bone fragments, and the moment it touched her boots it was inside her, a coldness that shot up her legs, seized her lungs, and turned her scream into a wet choke. Then it spoke aloud, in a voice like shattered bone. "You wear the iron," it rasped, pointing to the locket at her neck, "but iron rusts." Evelyn tore it off, flung it into the shadows, and in that instant, something deep inside her broke, something ancient and primal, the last firewall between what she was and what the house wanted her to become. And the whispers in the walls grew louder. Evelyn was not Evelyn anymore. Not fully. Some part of her, fractured and frayed, still clung to memory, still screamed inside the echo chamber of her skull, but the rest of her was moving now, walking in perfect darkness without stumbling, guided by a song only she could hear, a melody of loss and fury, and every step she took deeper into the subterranean halls of the house felt like a submission, a small death, a piece of her offered to the entity whose name was stitched into the marrow of every beam and board. She came to the devouring room. It had no door, only a curtain of human teeth strung like beads across the entrance, and when she pushed through them, they bit her skin, drawing blood that hissed as it touched the floor. Inside was a circle of mirrors, and in each reflection she saw herself, but not as she was. One version wept blood. One was stitched mouth to throat. One was already rotting. In the center stood Marianne, whole now, her hair long and black, her face pale and wet with tears, and in her arms she cradled something that twitched, a bundle of cloth, whispering in a baby's voice. "This is my grief," she said. "This is my child. This is my curse." And then she opened the cloth. Inside was Evelyn's own face, eyeless, mouth wide, screaming forever. They found her 3 days later, at dawn, lying outside the house's front steps with her eyes wide and her body cold, her skin covered in symbols burned deep into the flesh, the iron locket clenched so tightly in her palm that it had embedded into her bone. The police declared it exposure. The coroner listed cause of death as cardiac arrest. But the recorder, found near her body and returned to her family, continued to click and play long after its batteries should have died. In the background, beneath static, was a voice not Evelyn's. It whispered. It welcomed. And from inside the house, behind the boarded windows and rotted beams, something moved with breath again, something watching, something waiting for the next soul to listen too closely. Because the house remembers. And the house is hungry.